think for a moment about the affection in your life. Has it ever felt like a reward you had to work for?
Or maybe you've noticed your own feelings shifting, based on someone's actions or maybe who they're being at that moment.
Exactly. It's fascinating how those underlying conditions can operate just beneath the surface.
Hmm.
Because today, we're really digging into this whole idea of conditional love.
Right.
That's when affection, comes with strings attached. It's only given if certain things are in place.
And we're contrasting that with, well, unconditional love, that complete acceptance no matter what.
Totally. Our goal in this deep dive is really to understand just how this conditional stuff shapes the relationships we navigate every single day.
Yeah, from our very first family ties right through to our closest adult connections.
So to explore this, we've looked at, well, a few different angles.
Yeah, we've pulled from psychological studies some really rigorous work examining these patterns.
And also expert insights, people working right in the field.
And observations, too, just looking at broader trends in our culture that might be feeding into these dynamics.
And hopefully by the end of our conversation today, you listening should have a much clearer picture of how conditional love might impact your own relationships.
Yeah, the effects it can have on emotional well-being and maybe even just how common it is out there.
Get ready for maybe some aha moments as we unpack this. So let's start right at the beginning, shall we, with our parents.
Okay. What's really key to grasp here, I think, is that when a child experiences parental love as conditional, it sends this really powerful message.
Which is?
That their worth isn't just a given. It's something they have to constantly prove through what they do. One expert we looked at described it as kids feeling only worthy and deserving of love if they behave in ways that please the parents.
Not just for being themselves. Wow, that's a heavy weight for a kid.
It really is. And it can lead to some pretty fundamental challenges in how they see themselves.
Like what kind of challenges?
Well, they might develop this deep-seated belief that they have to be perfect to be loved.
Ah, that perfectionism thing.
Exactly. Internalizing this sense of being inherently, not quite good enough. And that underlying fear, the fear of losing that connection, it can be incredibly powerful.
It really can. Think about when parents maybe withhold affection as a way to discipline.
Right. The lesson a child learns isn't just about, say, cleaning their room or getting good grades.
It goes deeper.
Much deeper. They can start to believe that the world isn't emotionally safe, that love, this core need, can just disappear if they don't meet expectations.
And that must affect other relationships later on.
Oh, definitely. Unfortunately, over time, this can create this sort of ingrained expectation of rejection.
Which sadly sets the stage for things like ongoing anxiety.
Anxiety, feelings of deep shame, and even that relentless drive towards perfectionism we mentioned.
Always trying to measure up to avoid losing love.
Constantly. Now, these early experiences, they also play a huge role in shaping our attachment style as adults.
Okay, talk about that.
Well, research consistently shows this link between conditional affection in childhood and developing insecure attachment styles.
Insecure. How?
Well, one common pattern is avoidant attachment. Here, the child basically learns to just shut down their emotional needs.
Why would they do that?
Because they come to expect those needs won't be met anyway. It's kind of a self-protection thing,
Yeah.
avoiding disappointment.
Okay. And what's the other side of that coin?
That would be anxious attachment. In this case, kids who felt love was conditional might become hyper-focused on getting approval.
Constantly seeking reassurance.
Yeah, needing validation to quiet that deep fear that love could be taken away any minute.
Wow. And it's pretty telling how these early blueprints just keep influencing our adult relationships.
It really is. One therapist noted that adults from homes where their feelings were often dismissed, they tend to show these seemingly opposite behaviors.
Opposites. Like how?
Either they push people away, create distance, avoid real intimacy.
The avoidant pattern.
Right. Or they become really anxious, maybe clingy, constantly worried about abandonment.
The anxious pattern.
Exactly. But both stem from that same early lesson. Acceptance isn't free. You have to earn it.
That makes a lot of sense. If love felt like a prize that could be just revoked, you'd likely be constantly on guard. Now, how does this kind of conditional parenting affect a child's emotional growth? Their ability to, manage their own feelings?
This is where we see connections to ideas like self-determination theory.
Okay.
Think of conditional regard as a kind of social control. It really gets in the way of a child's basic needs for autonomy.
Like being in charge of themselves.
Yeah, making their own choices. And also relatedness, that feeling of genuine connection and belonging.
So instead of learning healthy ways to handle their emotions,
They often develop what psychologists call introjected regulation.
introjected regulation, what's that?
Imagine a kid cleaning their room, not because they see the point of being tidy, but because they're just scared of getting told off.
Ah, the motivation is external, but they've kind of swallowed it whole.
Exactly. It's internalized pressure. And this can lead to real struggles later with managing emotions healthfully.
Like what kind of struggles?
A tendency towards feeling distressed, lower self-compassion, being really hard on yourself.
That harsh inner critic.
Yeah, a really loud one.
That constant self-criticism, never feeling quite good enough. It's really quite sad. And I remember seeing some pretty concerning findings about self-esteem in the material we looked at.
Yes, there was a long-term study indicating that the vast majority of kids who got a lot of conditional regard ended up with what they called a low insecure self-esteem profile.
Low insecure, meaning?
Meaning their self-worth was fragile, easily knocked down. Only a small fraction developed that stable, secure sense of self that comes from feeling consistently loved, just as they are.
And those few with secure self-esteem.
They reported much greater life satisfaction and were significantly kinder to themselves, more self-compassion.
Which really highlights just how much conditional affection can chip away at a child's overall well-being.
Absolutely. And the implications for their mental health are also pretty significant, aren't they?
Seems like it would have to be.
Yeah. The data from multiple studies, meta-analyses even, clearly shows a strong link between parental conditional love and higher levels of anxiety and symptoms of depression in kids.
Wow.
These reviews have found that conditional regard actually predicts what they term maladaptive outcomes.
Maladaptive outcomes.
Things like lower self-esteem, ongoing emotional turmoil, distress, and even a greater likelihood of feeling angry or hostile.
And in the most difficult situations.
Tragically, yes. There is a connection to suicidal thoughts, particularly when kids feel utterly worthless because they feel love has been completely withdrawn.
That's devastating.
It really paints a picture of conditional parental love as this sort of chronic stressor with potentially very long-lasting negative effects.
Which is why experts are so clear about this.
Right. They strongly warn against taking away support or affection after a child makes a mistake. It's described flat out as unhealthy and damaging in one source.
It creates this really fragile foundation, doesn't it?
It does.
So it's probably not surprising then that these patterns we learn so early often just carry over into our adult romantic relationships.
That's a really crucial point. Those childhood experiences with conditional love, they definitely can lead to more, let's say, transactional approaches to affection and romance.
Transactional, like a business deal?
Sort of, yeah. As one expert explained, if you learn these conditions of worth as a kid.
Conditions of worth, meaning your value depends on meeting conditions.
Exactly. If you learn that, you might grow up believing that your achievements, what you do, that's what really matters in a relationship, rather than just who you inherently are.
So love becomes something you feel you constantly have to earn and re-earn.
Constantly.
Okay, so what are some of the warning signs? The red flags in a romantic partnership that might suggest this kind of conditional love is at play?
There are quite a few to look out for. One big one is that feeling of always walking on eggshells around your partner.
Being careful not to upset them.
Right. Always trying not to fall short of their expectations, whatever they might be. Passive-aggressive behavior is another one.
Ah, the silent treatment, maybe.
Or just like a cold, distant reaction when your needs aren't met. That can be an indicator too.
What else?
You might see scorekeeping. This sense that everything has to be perfectly balanced, like a tally sheet.
Tit for tat.
Or even emotional blackmail, where affection is clearly used as a reward for compliance.
Or withheld as punishment.
Precisely.
Gosh, that sounds incredibly stressful, constantly trying to anticipate and meet those maybe unspoken demands.
It absolutely is. And it often leads to feeling like you have to constantly perform to deserve the love.
Perform, like putting on a show.
In a way, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It can also fuel heightened jealousy and this persistent underlying fear that the love could just vanish if you fail to measure up somehow.
It would naturally create chronic anxiety.
Chronic anxiety, definitely. Yeah. And a tendency towards people-pleasing, putting your partner's needs way above your own.
And you mentioned withholding intimacy earlier.
Yeah, like using the silent treatment, specifically as a way to exert control or show displeasure. It's a power play.
It's all about maintaining a power dynamic, isn't it?
Seems like it often is.
And it sounds like those insecure attachment styles we talked about earlier, the anxious and avoidant ones, they show up here too.
Absolutely. They
Yeah.
manifest quite clearly in adult romantic bonds.
So the avoidant person.
They might still create that emotional distance, maybe fearing vulnerability or losing their independence if they get too close.
And the anxious one.
They might become very clingy, needing constant reassurance, driven by that deep-down fear of abandonment.
So in both cases, real secure connection is difficult.
Very challenging. Love feels conditional, fragile, not like a safe harbor.
Yeah.
One therapist even described these relationships as often being either high conflict
Constant fight.
or, conversely, feeling emotionally void, just
Yeah.
empty. Because they're built on demands and expectations, not real acceptance.
So it's really no wonder that satisfaction within these kinds of partnerships is often pretty low.
Exactly. Unlike those secure relationships built on, the unconditional stuff, these conditional ones tend to be quite fragile.
Fragile how?
Well, one analysis used the metaphor of an expiration date.
Ouch.
Yeah. The affection can just fade or disappear when circumstances change, or maybe expectations aren't met anymore.
Partners must feel like they're constantly being judged.
That's exactly how it's often described, feeling like you're on trial or always being tested rather than just accepted.
Which must kill trust.
It erodes trust, yeah.
Yeah.
Conflict tends to be more frequent. And there's even some research suggesting that people with a history of conditional love might unconsciously gravitate towards relationships that are, well, toxic or narcissistic.
Yeah, why would they do that?
Because those dynamics, sadly, can feel familiar, even if they're harmful.
Wow. So ultimately, it just leads to chronic unhappiness because you never feel fully seen or accepted.
That's the core of it, yeah.
It seems like a pretty pervasive pattern, and it's not limited to just our romantic connections, is it? Like, these conditional dynamics can even show up in friendships.
That's absolutely right. Friendships, which ideally, are built on mutual support and genuine acceptance, they can also become conditional.
How so?
It can happen when a friendship seems to revolve mostly around things like, say, social status or a constant exchange of favors.
Or even just expecting one person to always be the fun one.
Exactly. Or always agreeable.
Yeah.
And those early family experiences with conditional love, they definitely influence how we approach friendships later.
So that ingrained sense of needing to earn affection might make it harder to really open up with friends, to be vulnerable.
Precisely. There are empirical findings that actually back this up.
Really?
Yeah, one study found that young adults who felt their parents' love was conditional also tended to feel less secure in their closest friendships.
Less secure, leading to hesitation.
Yeah, a reluctance to be truly vulnerable. That fear of judgment or rejection, it kind of echoes those earlier experiences.
And that could lead to more superficial friendships.
Unfortunately, yes. It can contribute to friendships feeling more transactional, like you have to do things to keep the friendship going, rather than being based on genuine connection and intimacy.
So whether it's a partner or a friend, when acceptance feels conditional, it just weakens that essential trust.
It really does.
It all seems to come back to how we value ourselves, doesn't it? This idea of, what was it termed? Contingent self-esteem.
Absolutely. Conditional love really cultivates this sense that your worth as a person is tied directly to meeting certain external standards or expectations.
So if you fail, your self-esteem plummets.
See, it's a big hit.
Yeah. Self-determination theory helps us understand this, how conditional affection leads to internalizing those external standards as your own measure of worth.
So you basically adopt your parents' or partner's standards as your own way of judging yourself. Pretty much. Children learn to equate their value with their ability to meet those criteria. And as you can imagine, this results in a very fragile kind of self-esteem.
Fragile.
It's constantly vulnerable. It goes up and down based on your latest achievement or perceived failure.
It's like living under constant self-evaluation, never quite feeling secure in your own skin.
Exactly. A really exhausting way to live.
And we've already touched on the mental health implications, but it sounds like conditional love can have these broader negative consequences across all these different relationship types.
Yes. The research is pretty consistent here. Experiencing conditional love doesn't matter if it's from parents, partners, or friends. It's linked with higher rates of anxiety, depression, and just a lower sense of overall well-being.
Why does it have such a strong link to depression, do you think?
Well, that feeling of love being withheld, even subtly, it really thwarts those fundamental human needs for connection and autonomy we talked about.
Yeah.
And when those needs are consistently frustrated, it can definitely contribute to developing depressive symptoms.
Hmm?
As we mentioned, meta-analyses show strong positive correlations between conditional regard and both anxiety and depression.
And the flip side, unconditional support.
That acts as a powerful buffer. It fosters a more stable sense of self-worth, greater self-compassion, and generally higher life satisfaction.
So that constant pressure to earn love really takes a significant emotional toll.
It absolutely does. That relentless striving can lead to chronic stress, persistent low mood,
And in really tough cases.
as we touched on, even thoughts of suicide. And, as we've discussed, it also tends to breed mistrust and conflict within relationships themselves, which just adds another layer of negative impact on mental health.
It becomes a kind of vicious cycle, doesn't it?
It really can. Feeling unloved or inadequately loved can lead to behaviors that then further strain the relationships you have.
And it sounds like our general satisfaction in our relationships also suffers when conditional love is a big feature.
Exactly. The whole transactional nature that's inherent in conditional love,
Yeah.
it just fundamentally undermines trust.
And trust is the bedrock.
It's the bedrock of any healthy relationship. Studies consistently show that when people feel affection is conditional, the overall quality of their relationships tends to be lower.
Across the board, parents, partners, friends.
Seems so. Higher reported levels of parental conditional regard, for instance, they correlate with poorer parent-child relationships, less closeness, more problems.
And these effects spill over.
They often do. These patterns of difficulty in one area tend to extend into other relationships too.
It's like you never quite feel completely safe and accepted for just who you are.
That's a perfect way to put it. Unconditional acceptance creates this sense of emotional safety. One source called it like a place to rest.
A place to rest. I like that.
Yeah, where you don't feel constantly judged or evaluated. You feel free to mess up sometimes without that underlying fear that the love will be withdrawn.
And that builds deep trust, contentment.
Exactly. Conditional love, on the other hand, feels more like an ongoing obligation or a never-ending bargain you have to keep upholding.
Which just erodes closeness, reduces satisfaction in the long run.
Inevitably.
It really makes you consider the broader cultural context. I mean, is conditional love just like an inherent part of being human, or are there specific societal trends making it more common?
That's a really interesting question. There's definitely a viewpoint that modern culture, with its really strong emphasis on achievement, performance, even outward appearances, can inadvertently create an environment where conditional affection just thrives.
How so?
Well, think about how often praise and criticism are used in schools, for example. They're primary tools for managing behavior, motivating students.
Right. Stickers for good work, timeouts for bad behavior.
Exactly. Research has even pointed out that conditional regard is a widely used motivational strategy in classrooms, which can, unfortunately, leave kids feeling like their value is tied to how well they perform academically or behaviorally.
So almost from day one, we're kind of being conditioned to link approval with success.
It seems that way sometimes. And in certain cultural contexts, really high parental expectations are just the norm.
Like pressure to achieve specific things.
Studies have indicated, for example, that some parents might focus heavily on a child's mistakes, use harsh discipline to enforce strict standards, which can certainly create the feeling that love depends on meeting those high expectations.
And are parenting styles generally shifting this way?
Well, some meta-reviews suggest that parental conditional regard has become a more prominent strategy in recent decades, especially around academics.
Wow.
And one longitudinal study found that a surprisingly high percentage of parents, over 80%, admitted using some form of love withdrawal or control tactics to influence their kids' behavior.
Over 80%. That's huge. It suggests experiencing love as conditional might be way more common than we think.
It really might be.
And what about things like the rise of individualism or social media? Could they be playing a role?
It's certainly possible. In a more individualistic society, relationships might perhaps become more transactional based on what each person brings to the table.
And social media.
Well, social media can sometimes amplify this, right? People often gain approval based on their curated online image, their visible successes, their perceived status. It can feel very conditional.
True. But are there any counter trends? Is everyone just becoming more conditional?
Well, interestingly, no. It's important to acknowledge some shifts. A recent Pew survey, for instance, showed that many modern parents actually want to provide more affection and unconditional support than they felt they received themselves.
Ah, so like a reaction against older styles.
Potentially, yeah. reaction against maybe colder or more authoritarian parenting they experience.
But
There's often a struggle. Even with good intentions, many parents find it really tricky to set necessary boundaries without accidentally making their love feel conditional. It's a fine line.
it definitely sounds like a delicate balance to strike. So, what's the sort of overall sense? Where do we stand culturally with conditional versus unconditional love?
I think many observers are noting a growing perception that truly unconditional love might be, well, less common than we'd hope.
You see that in discussions online, maybe?
Yeah, you see it reflected in popular discussions, even articles questioning if unconditional love is realistic or even good. And when you look at some data, like the relatively low percentage of young people reporting truly secure self-esteem,
It suggests unconditional acceptance might not be the norm for many.
it lends support to that idea, yeah. In our fast-paced, achievement-driven world, love can often feel like it comes with these unspoken terms and conditions.
Making the idea that love is something you earn feel more like the default setting.
It can certainly feel like a more dominant cultural narrative these days.
It's a bit concerning to think about, but just playing devil's advocate for a second. Are there any arguments in favor of conditional love? Any potential upsides?
It's interesting you ask. While most research highlights the harms, some parenting experts do suggest that a certain degree of what they might call reasonable conditionality can actually be useful
Useful how?
for teaching discipline, fostering motivation. For instance, this idea of outcome love, giving praise and support, specifically when a child succeeds at something.
Like, good job on your test. I'm proud of you.
Right. It's sometimes presented as a way to encourage good behavior, instill values, setting clear expectations, having consequences. That's often part of this view, too.
Okay. And maybe in other relationships, too, like teamwork?
Sure, in teams or collaborations, there are often mutual responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
That's a kind of conditionality, in a sense.
But even with those potential upsides, that fundamental issue tying self-worth to external validation, that still seems problematic, doesn't it?
Exactly, that's the core issue. Research suggests that even positive conditional regard, like giving extra praise for achievements, still carries emotional and motivational costs compared to just consistent unconditional support.
Costs like what?
Well, when kids learn love depends on meeting standards, they tend to internalize those standards as their main measure of self-worth, like we discussed.
Which can kill their own internal drive.
It can undermine their intrinsic motivation, yeah, their drive to do things just for the sake of doing them. So you might get short-term gains in, say, compliance or getting good grades.
But you sacrifice autonomy, emotional security.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
That seems to be the trade-off.
It sounds like a very fine line to walk, and one that could easily be crossed without meaning to.
It really is. Experts generally advise that the ideal approach involves a balance, unconditional love plus clear, consistent boundaries.
So consequences can be okay, but not withdrawing love itself.
Exactly. Using conditional praise or logical consequences might be a tool in the toolbox, but it becomes potentially damaging if that underlying foundation of genuine care and acceptance isn't solid.
And the overall research consensus.
The consensus is pretty clear. The potential benefits of conditional strategies are generally limited and often outweighed by the risks to self-esteem and relational trust.
Okay, so as we kind of wrap up our discussion here, what would you say is the most important takeaway from our deep dive into conditional love today?
I think the overwhelming evidence points to this. Conditional love tends to undermine healthy attachment, it negatively impacts our emotional well-being, and it generally decreases satisfaction across our relationships.
Family, romance, friends, the whole spectrum.
The whole spectrum, yeah.
And while, okay, there might be some nuanced arguments for certain conditional elements when it comes to, say, teaching responsibility.
The weight of the research really strongly suggests that a foundation of unconditional love is just. It's the much safer, more nurturing environment for healthy development.
Especially important to remember in today's culture.
I think so. In a culture where these conditional dynamics seem pretty common, it becomes really important for all of us, for you listening, to cultivate awareness of these patterns.
If the goal is more secure, fulfilling connections.
Exactly, if that's what we're aiming for.
Absolutely. Well, now that you've joined us for this deep dive into the complexities of conditional love, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Considering the dynamics we've explored today, what might be just one small, maybe intentional step you could take in your own relationships?
A step towards nurturing a greater sense of unconditional acceptance. maybe both for yourself and for the people around you.
It's definitely something worth reflecting on. We encourage you to think about these ideas and maybe check out some of the resources we touched on if you want to go deeper.
Thank you so much for engaging in this deep dive with us today.